Greetings, American literature scholars of America. By the end of this instructional video, you should be able to explain why stories, narratives, are an important field of study. And you should begin to think critically about the various texts in front of you, whether they're from your literature textbook, a news blog or podcast you follow, a social media thread, or Twitter feed. Stories make us human. They tell us who we are and where we come from. They connect us to the entire human family, as every culture in the world engages in storytelling. It can be interesting to look at the types of narratives that get passed down and retold over and over again. And what about cross-cultural narratives? Similar stories or archetypes that reappear over vast spaces of place and time. The hero's quest, for instance, or the trickster. The theme of good versus evil, or the gods versus man, or the goddess figure who aids the hero in his quest. Why are some of these same stories found all over the world, shared between cultures that created stories independently of one another? Storytelling also creates empathy, particularly for groups or peoples that, on the surface, we might say we have nothing in common with. Consider some ways that you might find examples of narrative at work in the world today. Whether you realize it or not, you are a storyteller, even if you're just talking to yourself, which I do all the time. And you are continuously surrounded by storytellers. The proliferation of the internet has become ubiquitous with storytelling. Just think of all the countless internet subcultures and the various, often competing narratives they produce. Perhaps in literature textbooks of the future, students will be reading and analyzing these texts from the internet. How cool is that? Can you imagine this student of the future? That's only the second time I'm going to do that. Analyzing your Facebook updates, or your emails to your sister, or your text messages to your boo. Do you think Sarah Kemble Knight, and she's in our textbook, intended for her journal to make it into a literature anthology? Or Anne Bradstreet's personal poetry to end up in circulation? Or Samson Occam, the first Native American preacher to physically set down his narrative, as opposed to the oral tradition? Which brings up another point. Once a text is written, it no longer belongs to the writer. I'm not talking about copyright, which certainly is an interesting point of study in early colonial texts, as it was nearly non-existent at the time. People didn't really make a living at writing until the 19th century. No, I'm talking about how future audiences may engage with the text that now exists outside of the writer's own headspace. More on that later. Let's dig into our central question: who is telling the story, and why is that important for our understanding of colonial literature? Let's turn to our table of contents in the Norton Anthology to check out some of America's first written word. This may be the first time you've cracked the book. Hint: to succeed in the class, crack it again.
So who is telling the story? We might well wonder. Who is represented in this book? What kinds of stories are contained here? And to whom are these stories directed to? Meaning, who is the intended audience? If we gather all of the writers from our textbook together, some striking demographics present themselves. Concerning gender, it appears that the majority of writers are, not surprisingly, male. The unknown percentage in this Pac-Man pie chart refers to stories from the oral tradition, the indigenous people's mode of storytelling, and the way they passed on information without written language. This unknown also includes orations, speeches by native peoples. Speeches delivered to a crowd. Someone in the audience would have recorded the speech as it was being delivered. We might well question its accuracy and the constraints the transcriber might have been under. It's also important to note that many of these oral narratives in the unknown group were not recorded until much later, most likely the late 19th and early 20th centuries by white anthropologists. Be sure to add oral tradition to your notes. It will be on the first exam. If we look at the writer's country of origin or ethnicity, we see that the majority represented here are mostly European colonizers and Euro-Americans. Again, No surprise there, as most native peoples relied on the oral tradition, and the slave trade, on the whole, prohibited Africans from learning to read or write. We do want to be careful when considering Europeans as one unified group. They certainly were not. If we wanted to break this demographic down further, we would find writers from England, France, Spain, Germany, Italy, and Holland. And again, that's just from our textbook. Who didn't make it into the final cut of our Norton? This first genre of American literature, the written word, deals with the study of the origins of the New World. Various types of these early colonial stories will deal with the lay of the land in landscape descriptions, descriptions of the native inhabitants, journals, letters, poetry, government and law documents, histories of a colony or a settlement, and religious texts. Lastly, we have a pie chart illustrating the breakdown of the social class of writers in our textbook. You'll notice that the majority of these writers are part of a religious colony or group, landed gentry, meaning wealthy landowners, or they're explorers, writing about finding glory and riches for king and country. If we wanted to simplify these groups further, we could break these writers down into working class and non-working class. So, according to the writers featured in our textbook, it would appear that the dominant narrative of early colonial America was produced mostly by Christian European and Euro-American men. And of course, having money, or a corporation, or a throne to back your expedition to the New World doesn't hurt. It doesn't mean that this perspective of the Euro-Christian male is wrong. It's just that it provides only a partial and perhaps incomplete guide to understanding the beginnings of the great American experiment. Consider this quote from Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. Zinn is a historian, author, and activist, and here he writes about the importance of the storyteller's identity, how ethnicity, gender, and social class might influence one's storytelling. We must not accept the memory of states as our own. Nations are not communities and never have been. The history of any country, presented as the history of a family, conceals fierce conflicts of interests, sometimes exploding, most often repressed, between conquerors and conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers, dominators and dominated in race and sex. I prefer to tell the story of the discovery of America from the viewpoint of the Arawaks, of the Constitution from the standpoint of the slaves, of Andrew Jackson as seen by the Cherokees, of the Civil War as seen by the New York Irish, of the Mexican War as seen by the deserting soldiers of Scott's army, of the rise of industrialism as seen by the young women in the Lowell textile mills, of the Spanish-American War as seen by the Cubans, the conquest of the Philippines as seen by black soldiers on Luzon, and so on, to the limited extent that any one person, however he or she strains, can see history from the standpoint of others. We've probably all heard of Columbus sailing the ocean blue, of the Pilgrims, of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, but there's much more to be mined from this age of discovery than just the historical highlights, which can often be missing important historical context, like the fact that Columbus never actually landed in the mainland United States. He landed in the Caribbean and thought he was in Asia. Or that the Pilgrims were just as intolerant toward other faiths as the English crown was intolerant of the Puritans. Or that the Dutch and Spanish and French had just as much stake in the not yet formed nation as did the English.
Think of the United States as a story. How might this story influence American identity and character? Whose stories have been left out? What stories have been lost to time? We are ever expanding the definition of what it means to be an American. Who knows what stories have yet to be discovered? Let's revisit that question from the beginning of the video. How do future audiences engage with a text that now exists outside of the writer?
In the present moment, we mostly engage with narrative, with story, online. This is where we share our own stories and read, listen, watch, share the stories of others. Maybe you've heard of the Moth Story Hour, a weekly live storytelling contest that you can listen to on public radio, or Humans of New York, a collection of interviews and accompanying photographs from folks in New York, but also around the world. Or maybe you're a fan of veterans poetry, or videos from BuzzFeed, or College Humor. Now I want you to try something for me. Think of the last time you got into an argument with someone online. Perhaps a friend or an acquaintance posted something that you vehemently disagreed with. You tell your friend so by responding to their post. Perhaps others join the fight as well, maybe some trolls who stoke the flames. Maybe you get really angry, or maybe you laugh at the ongoing dispute unfolding in front of you, on a public forum no less. Who will be able to read this public debate in the future? Will it forever survive somewhere online, like a personal archive of your life? Think about how much text is uploaded or recorded online every single day. That is a lot of information. Maybe you and your friend agree to disagree, or perhaps your friend tells you, "I didn't mean it the way you took it." Or perhaps you unfriend each other because your friend's worldview angers you. Check out this 2016 analysis of social media use by the Pew Research Center. It shows a steady increase over time in social media use. Perhaps this isn't surprising. We're social creatures after all, and we're just addicted to story. Here's a thought experiment. Is social media, where we spend so much of our time, the literature of the future? Sci-fi geek out moment. Is this where textbooks and historical documents will all be housed in the future? Ooh, or will they be accessible through a chip in our brain that you can access just by thinking? When you are using social media, it can be difficult to tell how others, even people you know and like, will react to what you write, post, or say. But know that your status updates, your tweets, your data, your story is out there, as well as everyone else's. In this brave new world, everyone is given a voice. If you have access to the internet, you can tell your story, regardless of who you are or where you come from. So with this explosion of storytelling, what will be saved? What stories will be passed on? What forgotten? What image will it paint of the early 21st century, of the national character? What story will it tell? Might one of your posts end up in a social media archive or a student's textbook in 100 years, 200 years, 500 years? When doing your own reading and writing, whether for this class or another, whether on social media or some other outlet, consider your own rhetorical purpose and the purpose of each text you come across. Be sure to ask, who is the author? What audience does the writer assume? What evidence does he or she provide? Questions you may want to pose to any storyteller or writer. What perspectives are they likely to have? What is their ultimate goal, their rhetorical purpose in writing down their narrative? Are they trustworthy? And it's perfectly sound to answer, no, he or she is not trustworthy. But be sure you can support your evaluation with evidence from the text itself. Rhetoric will be a word you will hear me use throughout the semester, and one that I want you to be familiar with. Rhetoric means the art of effective persuasion. So let's begin thinking about what these authors are trying to persuade their audiences of. And here is where I leave you. Who is telling the story shapes the content of that person's narrative. What story are you telling about the present moment?